Okay, so this is the second lesson that I want to explain, talking about how we can download information from the internet, all right? In the first lesson, we talked about the protocols, and we talked about the different standard protocol available in Swift. And the one of interest to us in particular is the one that is called codable protocol. Before we start getting data from the internet and then displaying it in our app, I want to cover another unit from the data collection developed in Swift from the data collection book, and we're covering unit 2.4, which is working with the web and HTTP URL. So let's take a look at this. Let me play that in window. This information should be basics to you because you're already familiar with most of it, but I'll go over it quickly. So you use either HTTP protocol or HTTPS protocol. This HTTP or HTTPS protocol, they have namings, they follow certain standards. For example, you have the domain name, the subdomain name, the path of the information you're looking for, and so forth. All right. So it is HTTP protocol, and this is HTTPS for secure information. All right. So if you want to use open protocol, you use HTTPS, HTTP, and if you want to use secure protocol, we use HTTPS secure. If you look at this here, we're going to look at all the different parts of this URL. The first part is the subdomain, and this is an optional. What is a subdomain? In this example, we use www.finance.returndeco.com and then port 80. Now, finance is a subdomain, and this is optional. You don't have to do that. And then sometimes if you go to the portal, for example, you see the link changes depending on what you're accessing, all right? So this is subdomain that belong to the domain. What is the domain? The domain is actually this returndeco.com, all right? So that is the unique registered name for your company or for the company on the internet, right? So usually it is .com, .org, .gov, for example. They have different domain types. The next thing is that you can specify a port, and the ports are important when you are testing your application, for example, or you want to open certain ports for the user to come through, and then you want to block other ports. The one that is the default port that you don't have to specify is the one 80. 80 is the default port where all HTTP requests come to. If you want a specific port people come through, then you will have to specify that different protocol, different port. For HTTPS, the port number is 443. For HTTP, we use 80 as a default. So you do not have to specify that port. You just simply ignore it if you're just using the default ports for HTTP or HTTPS. The next part is we're going to take a look at the path. After you specify the company, the subdomain, or the website, then you want to specify where do you want to go there. And that usually comes after that port, / and then it has a long list of maybe a folder, a library, whatever you want to do with, whatever you have structure on your server, and then the resource name that you're looking for. So in this case, we are looking for a folder called receivables, and the document name is archive January 2017.pdf. All right. Sometimes you want to pass parameters to your within your web request. And how do you specify these parameters in the web request? You specify them by like this. You put the name of the parameter name, and if you have a space, in this case, space, usually it is a question mark, file name, and then the value that you want to send equal the value you want to send. Again, if you want to separate, if you have multiple parameters, you separate them by the and then you put another parameter and then another value. So this question mark is the start of the query string. And then if you have multiple parameters, you separate those by the %. There are different requests that you can send. So typically, if you want to get data from the server, we use the GET request. And most of us, we don't do that. It just automatically happens because we don't know. When we type in the URL, it gives you basically issuing a GET request. If you want to post something on the internet, if you want to collect information in a form and you want to send it to a server, then we usually use the POST request. It's more secure and the parameters are shielded, all right? They're not in the open. If you want to update something, information on your server, then we usually use the PUT request. And if you want to delete something from your applications on the server, then you use the delete request, all right? There is different part of your request and response. There is HTTP headers that allow you to, the client and the server, to exchange information. In the header, you can say what type of computer is accessing the server. So is what type of operating system is issuing the request. That's on the request. In the response, you can say what type of response that you got from the server. Well, what is the server information? That you can share that information in the header. It's used for authentications, send information such as computer browser type to the server, and respond information such as the server type, software used to handle your request. All right. So header is used to communicate between the client and the server about certain information, just like I mentioned here, such as the for security, authentication, the server type, the computer type, operating system, all that kind of information. The body is what we see most of the time. The body is what I send to the server or what I receive from the server, right? So for example, if I send a request, I say, give me, download the JSON data that we will be working with, it'll come in the body. So the body usually is either formatted text or CSS, images, or any other kind of information that you receive, HTML information that you receive from the server, all right? This is the start of creating a URL request or a web request in your Swift. This is what is important for us. The previous information is for you to understand that it's like a background on web technologies, but this is what we're going to be using in this course. First, you need to create a URL. A URL object basically receive a string and the path of the website or this resource that you want to access. This, notice, it's an optional variable. Why is this optional variable? Because sometimes in the string here, you could have invalid characters that are not accepted as a web URL. Now, it's almost impossible to do that because there's a lot of leeway on how many the different type of characters you include in the URL. But for safety reasons, it's going to give you either a valid or invalid URL. In most cases that I've seen, it's valid, right? Because we're using plain text, we're using the keyboard to enter those, the URL. So after you get this URL, then you need to use it. And we use the URL session. The URL session .shared is a common instance. It's a shared instance in your application. So this one allows me to create a task that I can execute on the server. What server? The server that we specified in the URL. So what are we doing here? Let task, we're creating a task, URL session .shared .data task. So we're creating a data task for the URL that we've created. Now, here we use closures. Now, we haven't covered closures yet, but a closure basically, when you finish executing this task, you will get response. And usually this happens in the background. So you're not waiting. Your UI elements, your application is not waiting. You can act normally on your app. You can click buttons. You can navigate in your app. But when it finishes, when this request finishes, because in nature, when you go to the website, there are scenarios where you might not get the response right away, such as the server is slow, or the server is not available, or the URL that you're specifying is wrong. So this task has a closure. We call it, it's a closure. When it finishes, you would receive the following. This is the beginning of the closure, and this is the ending of that closure. You would receive data. If you got some data, you will get a response from the server telling you, could be maybe the file is not found, or there are different responses that you can get, or you can receive an error, right? So you need to check in your application, do I have data or not? If I have data, then I can act on the data. So this is the parameters that we receive from the request. And this is because we said we're using a completion handler and closures. When it's completed, this is the code that we will execute. First, we're using optional binding here to say, if data equal data means this. For those ones that took Swift before, that means this will give you either nil or values. So if you got some value in data, then we continue. If it got nil, we don't do anything. It doesn't do this block of code. So it says, if data equal data means that we actually got some data. I change it. I create a string with encoding, Unicode. There are many encoding, but for now, because we wanted to print it out, we use encoding Unicode 8. And then we print the result. This task, just creating the task, it does not get executed. To execute that task, you need to say task dot resume. This actually send the request and then execute it. All right. Now, we did that last time in our application, but I want to go over it again, so make sure that you understand it. There's a lot of stuff happening. I want to make sure that you understand it. Is that clear? Sometimes you can send a request with API, we call it. So you can actually send a key. Now you can do that by including it. You can include these keys in the parameter list of the URL. You can hard code it like that. Or you can use a component, which you're going to see later on. But this would work. Same thing. The only thing that's different is that your URL is different, and it uses, it's an API, and it uses a key to access those APIs. Same thing. We get search session, get the data, resume the task, same as before. And this is the data that you will get from NASA. And then notice here you have a bracket here, and we have some values, some keys and their value, some keys and their values. All right, some keys and their values. This is what we're going to cover in the next section about JSON. So this is how the data that we'll get with JSON, we can encode this object into actually a structure that you can use within your application. All right. The last thing I'm going to cover here in this one is not, you know, you can do it, as I said, if you're using API, you can use this, you can hard code it, or if you don't want to do that, you create a URL component, and then you have an array of keys like that, and then you map these keys, and it will embed these keys in the URL. So you don't have actually to put it in the you don't have to hard code it, all right? So this is the same example with the URL component, and then you map those keys. Instead of putting it in the URL, you actually create these keys and add them to the URL using the URL components. And then the rest is the same. So you can use this way or use the other way, it's fine. Okay, for this course, most likely we will use this way, all right? But you can do it the other way as well if you have a lot of keys. That's it for this topic. Any questions?